You may have heard about the Louvre heist in October 2025. 7 minutes. That's all it took for thieves to walk out of one of the most guarded museums in the world, carrying, among other things, a diamond bow brooch that had survived 2 empires, 1 republic, a revolution in manners, and a century of American ambition. But here's what the headlines didn't tell you. Before that brooch ever sat in a glass case in Paris, it lived somewhere far more extraordinary, pinned to the bodice of a woman who held no title, wore no crown, and answered to no government. A woman who, in the last decades of the 19th century, decided, entirely on her own authority, who mattered in America and who did not. Her name was Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, and the brooch she wore had previously belonged to an empress. How does a New York socialite end up owning a piece of the French crown jewels? What did she do with it? And why, more than a century after her death, does that jewel still carry her name? That is the story we're telling today. A Dutch princess in a new world. To understand what Caroline became, you have to understand what she was born into and what that world demanded of her. She arrived on September 22, 1830, into the Schermerhorn family, one of old New York's Dutch patrician dynasties whose roots reached back to the city's colonial beginnings. Her father, Abraham Schermerhorn, was a wealthy merchant and shipping magnate. At the time of her birth, his fortune was estimated at around $500,000. In the 1830s, that was not merely comfortable, it was a verdict. It announced, without a word being spoken, exactly where the Schermerhorns stood in the order of things. And in the New York Caroline grew up in, that order was everything. This was a city that had no court, no aristocracy, no hereditary titles, and yet it was obsessed with all 3. Old families like the Schermerhorns, the Van Cortlandts, the Whites, watched European courts with the intensity of people who wanted what they saw but could never quite claim it. Lineage was currency, deportment was destiny. A woman's pearls, the sheen of her fabrics, the cut of her gown, these were not decorations. They were arguments. They told the room who you were before you opened your mouth. Caroline was educated by a French émigré teacher. She became fluent in French, steeped in European manners, trained in the visual grammar of a world that took elegance seriously as a form of power. She grew up understanding instinctively that display was not vanity, it was communication. The family moved northward through Manhattan as Lower Manhattan became crowded and commercial. First near Bowling Green, then to Bond Street. Always one step ahead of the noise, always maintaining pride of place at the social frontier. It was a pattern Caroline would repeat her entire life. In September 1853, she married William Backhouse Astor Jr., grandson of fur magnate John Jacob Astor and heir to one of the largest fortunes in the United States. The match united her respectable old Dutch lineage with the towering wealth of the Astors, who owned vast swathes of New York real estate. But notice what she did almost immediately. She made him drop Backhouse from his name. Too vulgar, she decided. Not the right sound for the world she intended to build. That seemingly small act tells you everything. She was not marrying into the Astor fortune. She was acquiring it as raw material. She was already editing reality to fit a more aristocratic script, and she had barely unpacked her trunks. Building a throne on Fifth Avenue. The Civil War ended, and New York's economy exploded. Railroads, steel, finance, industry, fortunes were being made overnight by men whose grandfathers had been nobody. Suddenly, the city was full of families with vast new money and no pedigree, no calling cards, no connection to the old Dutch and English families who had quietly governed New York society for generations. Caroline saw it clearly. If she did nothing, these newcomers would swamp the old order. If she moved decisively, she could position herself as the gatekeeper, the woman who stood between respectable old wealth and the rising tide of new millions. She found her instrument in Ward McAllister, a southern-born social climber with an extraordinary gift for ceremony and an absolute devotion to Caroline's vision. Together, they constructed what became known as the 400, the people who truly mattered in New York. The number was popularly linked to the capacity of Mrs. Astor's ballroom at 350 Fifth Avenue. McAllister claimed there were only 400 people in the city genuinely comfortable in a ballroom. What he meant was, only 400 people Caroline had decided to acknowledge. On February 16, 1892, the New York Times published the official list. It was a public coronation of a private power, transforming personal calling lists into a civic hierarchy. And it worked, because Caroline enforced it with absolute consistency. Her annual January ball became the symbolic summit of the social year. Invitations were counted and dissected in the press. Descriptions of her gown and jewels were treated almost as state bulletins. And those jewels. Picture the scene. Caroline receiving guests in her Fifth Avenue mansion, standing beneath her own portrait by the French painter Carolus Duran, a painting that deliberately echoed the court portraits of Velázquez, all dark velvet and high lace collar, a woman who understood herself as a grande dame on par with old-world nobility. She wore deep jewel tones, purple, dark blue, forest green, colours chosen, consciously or not, to make white diamonds blaze and emeralds burn. Contemporary accounts describe her wearing a diamond tiara, a diamond collar, and what would become her most famous possession. A massive diamond stomacher covering the front of her bodice, with bows and tassels of diamonds cascading downward. She wore her wonderful emeralds, set off by a profusion of diamonds. She wore ropes of pearls across the bodice. And here is the detail I find almost cinematic. Her jewels were so heavy, the diamond brackets, the stomacher, the ornaments pinned across her back, that they physically prevented her from leaning back in her chair. What her guests read as regal poise, that famous upright stillness, was partly the practical necessity of managing kilos of diamonds pinned to silk and velvet. The armour was literal. Who is the Mrs. Astor? For years, Caroline had operated under a constraint that quietly rankled. Her sister-in-law, Charlotte Augusta, wife of John Jacob Astor III, was technically the senior Mrs. Astor. While Charlotte lived, Caroline was properly Mrs. William Astor, a reminder that she was the wife of a younger brother, not the matriarch. She was patient. When Charlotte died in 1887, Caroline moved. She dropped the William and began calling herself simply Mrs. Astor, implying that she, not her nephew's wife, represented the head of the family. In a world where the Astor name was synonymous with the greatest private fortune in America, that possessive Mrs. was not a social nicety. It was a crown. William Waldorf Astor, Charlotte's son, was outraged. As the male heir, he considered himself the head of the family and his wife the rightful Mrs. Astor. He demanded Caroline revert to Mrs. William Astor. She refused. Unable to force the issue socially, William Waldorf chose architectural revenge. In 1890, he razed his own mansion, which stood directly adjacent to Caroline's house on Fifth Avenue, and replaced it with the luxurious Waldorf Hotel, a towering commercial building built deliberately against his aunt's wall. The construction noise tormented her. The presence of a vast public hotel transformed what had been an elite residential block into a bustling commercial corridor. Caroline's response, orchestrated through her son John Jacob Astor IV, was to tear down their own mansion and build the Astoria Hotel next door. The two hotels were eventually joined by a grand corridor, Peacock Alley, creating the original Waldorf Astoria, at that time the largest and most famous hotel in the world. A family quarrel over a name on a calling card had reshaped a city block. The combined site would one day be cleared for the Empire State Building. The title, Mrs. Astor, that was the jewel they were fighting over, Worn, contested, defended with the same ferocity as any diamond. The night she had to bow. But the most humiliating episode of Caroline's reign did not come from within the family. It came from outside, from a woman who had decided that old money's contempt was a problem she would solve with a party. Alva Vanderbilt, wife of William K. Vanderbilt, daughter-in-law of the rail tycoon Cornelius Vanderbilt, had built an enormous French chateau-style mansion at 5th Avenue and 52nd Street. In March 1883, she announced a lavish fancy dress ball for some 1,200 guests. At that time, Caroline had refused to recognize the Vanderbilts socially. Under the strict etiquette of the day, one could not invite someone whose calling card had never crossed the threshold. Mrs. Astor had never called on the Vanderbilts, therefore Alva could not invite her. But Alva had thought this through. Invitations went to all of Caroline's daughter Carrie's friends. Carrie herself received nothing. When Carrie, devastated, asked why, Alva's answer was precise and devastating. She could not invite Miss Astor because her mother had never called and therefore she had no address for her. Carrie begged her mother to fix it. Caroline faced a choice that had no good outcome. Refuse, and her daughter was publicly excluded from the most talked-about event of the season. Comply, and she admitted, in the most visible way possible, that the Vanderbilts had forced her hand. She ordered her carriage to the Vanderbilt mansion and left her calling card. The next day, the Astors received their invitation. At the ball, amid glittering costumes and theatrical displays of wealth, Caroline appeared, acknowledging in person what she had tried to deny on paper. Old money and new money shared a room. The rules of the Gilded Age were being rewritten, not by law, not by revolution, but by a calling card left on a silver tray. She arrived, of course, in her finest diamonds, old New York jewels blazing in a palace built with Vanderbilt money, a visual truce, if not a surrender. The Empress's brooch becomes Mrs. Astor's armour. Now I want to tell you about the year 1887, the same year Caroline seized the title Mrs. Astor, and what was happening simultaneously in Paris. The French Third Republic had decided to auction off most of the crown jewels. The relics of queens and empresses, Marie Antoinette, Empress Eugénie, were going under the hammer at the Louvre. The Republic was selling the symbols of the monarchy it had replaced. Among the lots was a diamond bow brooch created by the jeweller François Kramer for Empress Eugénie in 1855. Originally designed as a belt buckle, it had been transformed into a large stomacher, a massive ornament covering the front of the bodice, with diamond tassels and cascading pompils. It was a technical masterpiece of 19th-century French jewellery, and it had been worn by an empress at the height of the Second Empire. At the Louvre sale that May, a dealer named Emile Schlesinger purchased the bow brooch. He then sold it to Caroline Astor. She paid around 42,200 francs. From that moment, it was no longer called the Empress's brooch. It was called Mrs. Astor's diamond stomacher. Think about what that transfer meant. An American woman, no title, no throne, no hereditary claim to anything, had purchased a former crown jewel of France. She had bought a relic of monarchy with the proceeds of American commerce, and she wore it, not in a palace, but in a Fifth Avenue ballroom under a portrait designed to evoke Velázquez, receiving guests who had been selected by her personal judgment. At the Metropolitan Opera in 1904, the Washington Post reported that Mrs. Astor wore a white gown with black satin ribbons, a tiara, a girdle of diamonds, a necklace, and at the center, a large diamond bow brooch with long tassels, the stomacher in full. This was not vanity. This was a statement that no amount of old money restraint could have made as clearly. In the New World, wealth could do what lineage alone could not. It could buy the very relics of monarchy. Caroline Astor, in wearing that brooch, was saying something that the Gilded Age had never quite said out loud, that America had not rejected the idea of queens. It had simply decided to produce its own. Diamonds in an empty ballroom. The family feud that produced the Waldorf Astoria also pushed Caroline uptown. In the 1890s, she commissioned a new double mansion at the northeast corner of 5th Avenue and 65th Street, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, one half for her, one for her son John Jacob and his family. It faced Central Park. It was the last palace. The January balls continued. In 1904 and 1905, the press reported around 600 guests, the second Monday in January fixed as the traditional night. Caroline appearing in deep purple velvet panelled with blue satin and embroidered in gold, her diamonds and emeralds blazing under electric light, still new enough then to make stones sparkle in an almost otherworldly way. But by the early 1900s, something was shifting. Her health was failing. Sources from the period note intermittent dementia, a withdrawal from the world she had once commanded with unshakable confidence. In 1905, she fell on the staircase of her Fifth Avenue mansion and broke her hip. The injury left her increasingly confined, the queen of society, brought low by a fall in her own palace. She died on October 30th, 1908, aged 78, with her daughter Carrie at her bedside. Newspapers marked her passing as the end of an era. Outside, new social figures, Mamie Fish, Teresa Fair Ulrichs, Alva Belmont, the same Alva who had once forced Caroline's calling card, were already reshaping what society meant. 4 years later, the Astor name would be written into a different kind of history. Her son, John Jacob, the man who had built the Astoria to avenge her, who had helped her fight the name war, boarded the RMS Titanic with his young second wife, Madeline. He placed her into a lifeboat and did not follow. The richest passenger on the most famous ship in the world died in the North Atlantic in evening clothes in the freezing dark. The fortune Caroline had spent a lifetime guarding sailed into a new century and met an ending no amount of diamonds could prevent. And here is the detail that stays with me. After her death, appraisers examining her estate discovered that her famous 5-strand pearl necklace, the one she had worn to countless balls, the one guests had admired for decades, contained imitation pearls. Whether this is strictly accurate or has grown in the telling, it has become part of the mythology around her collection. Even the Queen of Old New York, it seems, sometimes chose the effect over the substance. The jewel returns home. In 2008, a century after Caroline's death, the Empress Eugénie Beau brooch, Mrs. Astor's diamond stomacher, was acquired through Christie's in a private sale and returned to the Louvre. Returned to the same building where it had gone under the hammer in 1887. It sat in a glass case, no longer on a bodice, no longer doing the work of a crown. Until October 2025, when it was gone in 7 minutes. Most likely dismantled by now, the diamonds scattered. The bow that once sat at the center of an empress's court dress, then at the center of an American woman's social empire, reduced to components. Caroline Astor had no throne, no crown, no title. She had calling cards, guest lists, a portrait designed to look like a Velázquez, and a diamond brooch that had once belonged to Empress Eugénie. With those tools, she decided who mattered in the most powerful city in the emerging most powerful nation on earth. The brooch has completed its journey. Monarchy, money, museum, and now, gone. But here's what I keep thinking about. The thieves took the jewel. They couldn't take the story. If this kind of history, the women behind the jewels, the power behind the pearls, is what you come here for, a like on this video genuinely helps more people find it. And if you want to be here for the next one, subscribing is how you make sure you don't miss it. I'd love to know, do you think Caroline Astor was a queen in everything but name? Or was she something more interesting than that? Tell me in the comments.